I'm going to introduce both methods of factoring using the box method and also the grouping method. Anytime you start out with a factoring problem, it's good to have a little bit of a roadmap. Let me zoom out just a tad here. And I'll have to zoom out a lot for this. All right, so each time you're confronted with factoring, you're going to want to make sure that if there's a GCF, you factor it out. And then you have to pay close attention to how many terms you're given. In this case, we have 3 terms. There is a leading coefficient other than 1, so we're going to use the box or the grouping method. Okay? Let's go ahead and get started on our first one. So when we say factor, we're trying to get these 3 terms that are being added into basically 2 sets of parentheses. Sometimes it's a little more involved, but you're trying to turn 3 things that are being added into usually 2 things that are being multiplied. In this case, we have a leading coefficient other than 1, so you multiply 6 times 20. That gives you 120. And you'll need to list all the factors of 120. So 120, 260, 3 goes into 12 4 times, so 3 times 40. 4, you double 2, cut 60 in half. 5 goes into 12 once. Oh, darn. 5 goes into 12 twice. So we'll just make that a 2. And there'd be 20 left over, so that'd be 24. So 5 times 24 is 120. 6, double the 3, cut 40 in half. 7, if you think about it, it won't work. 8, double the 4. Go off my paper here. Well, we'll see. This will just work. I'll need a little bit more room. So for 8, I doubled the 4, cut 30 in half. 9, you can think about it, but it won't work. And then 10 times 12 gives us 120. So we've listed all the factors of 120. We're looking for, since that's positive, we're looking for a sum of positive 23. We want a positive 23 because that's a positive 23. And we want a sum because the only way to get a positive here would be positive times positive or negative times negative. So we would be adding like terms over here. All right, you should already be familiar with some of that from earlier factoring. And to find a sum of positive 23, if you work your way down the list, none of these are going to work until you get down to 8 and 15. That'll give you a sum of 23. Okay, but unlike before, I can't just use my 8 and 15. I can't just put them directly into my parentheses here. Okay, so because if you think about it, 8 times 15, that certainly won't give me a 20. All right, even though it will give me my middle term, my 23. So the box method, give yourself a 4-chamber box. The first term goes in the first box. The last term goes in the last box. And then these 2 terms that we did all the trouble to find go in these 2 boxes. It doesn't matter which one goes in where, you just got to use them both. So there's the 8 and there's the 15. Now there's one other thing to keep in mind here. This is, if we back up to here, this was 6x squared times 20. That actually gave us 120 x squared. So each of these terms actually has an x here, but it's way too much trouble to keep writing them every single time. Okay? So instead of putting x's all the way down both sides, you just have to remember to put the x in each box. Okay? Because this is really 8x and 15x. All right? If we add 8x to 15x, we'll get 23x. So that part is how they land in here. And now this next step, you factor, you see what is the greatest common factor going straight up for these two boxes. What's the GCF? Between a 20 and a 15x, 5 is the greatest common factor. Then you go straight up of these two boxes with a 8x and a 6x squared. 2x is the greatest common factor. Then you go across. 6x squared, 15x. I can get a 3x out of each term. So 3x is the GCF going across. And then going across the bottom. There's no x here, so I can't get an x out, but with an 8 and a 20, 4 is the GCF. We now have the factored form. 2x, that's positive 5. And 3x, that's positive 4. So this is the factored form, and you could check it. And notice 5 times 4 would give us that 20. It's harder to follow when you're interrupted a lot. Once you get used to the flow of this, it's a little bit easier to pull it off. We'll look at a very similar problem and show you something that happens with the negative sign. So let's say I had 6x squared minus 23x plus 20. Okay? Well, we've just listed all the factors of 120, but I'll just sort of quickly zoom through that again as if we were starting anew. Oops, looks like I could run out of room on this. All right, so 6 times 20 is 120, and then all the factors. All right, so we've listed all the factors, and this time we're looking for a sum because that's positive. Again, it must be positive times positive or negative times negative to get that positive 20. But we want a sum of negative 23. Sum of negative 23. And again, the only place it will get that, you work your way down the list, none of them will work until you get here. A negative 8, a negative 15, that would give you a negative 23. So you go ahead and give yourself a 4-chamber box. First term goes in the first box. Last term goes in the last box. And now these two terms go in the other two boxes. And again, it doesn't matter which one goes where. So I'll put my negative 8 here, my negative 15 here, and just as in the previous one, I have to remember the variable. Okay, this is really 120x squared. This is really negative 8x, negative 15x. So you have to remember to put your x's in here. Okay, now you're going to factor out, you're not actually factoring it out, but you're just saying, what is the greatest common factor? So I think I could zoom in a tiny bit on this. There we go. So looking, again, we'll go up, up, over, and over. This one has a little trick, though. If there's a negative there, you pull it out. So with 20 and negative 15x, the negative's there, so you just pull it out. And that gives you the GCF of 20 and 15 is 5. Okay. Then coming up here, this is a positive 6x, so no negative is coming out for this term. All right, the GCF is 2x. Then coming across here, again, that's positive. You can get a 3x out. And now coming across the bottom, negative's almost out, so it's coming out. And with the 20 and an 8, 4 is the GCF. Okay, so we now have the factored form. Give ourselves the parentheses. And the factored form is 3x minus 4. And I'll zoom out real quick. So you saw both methods, factor by box method, and this gave you a little idea of how to handle the negatives when they show up. We'll handle this same problem, but we'll use factor by grouping, okay? Okay, it starts out just the same. You multiply first times the last. That gives you 120, and you list all the factors. Oops, 6, I double 3, so I cut 40 in half, so that should be 20. Then 4, I double 4, and I cut 30 in half, that's 15. Alright, so I have all the factors of 120. And we're looking for a sum of 23. Alright. How to describe this. Sorry about that. So none of these would add up to 23 except a positive 8, a positive 15. And remember, we really multiplied 6x squared times 20. It's 120x squared. So each of these has an x. And with factor by grouping, instead of taking these two numbers and plopping them into the box, you basically rewrite this middle term as these two terms. So 23x can be written as a positive 8x and a positive 15x. Notice how these two combine to give you 23. This is the idea behind factor by grouping. You take this middle term and you split it into the correct two terms that will sum to give you 23. The 6x squared first term just sits in the first position, 6x squared. This last term plus 20, it sits in the last position. Okay? And now you come back and say, focusing just on the first two terms, that's the grouping part. You group together these first two, and you say, what's my greatest common factor out of these? It's a 2x. So I can factor out 2x from these two terms. Again, that means I'm dividing by 2x and dividing by 2x. Now when I do that, what's left? 6x squared divided by 2x leaves us with 3x. 8x divided by 2x leaves us with a 4. Then we turn our attention to the next two terms. And we'll get it. Looking at the 15x and the 20, what is the GCF? It's a positive 5. So I'm going to put plus 5, put my parentheses here. And I'm going to factor out this 5. So that means divide by 5, divide by 5. And what does that leave us with? 15x divided by 5 is 3x. 20 divided by 5 is positive 4. And now you basically repeat the process of factoring out the GCF. But notice, your GCF here, you have a 3x plus 4, and you have a 3x plus 4. So it might seem kind of strange, but this quantity in the parentheses, that's your GCF. And when you factor something out, what do? You put it in front of the parentheses. So here's 3x plus 4 in front of another set of parentheses. If I factor out 3x plus 4, that really means I'm dividing by 3x plus 4. So that goes into itself, and you're left with 2x. Okay. And then I turn my attention to this group. I'm factoring out 3x plus 4. So that means I'm dividing by 3x plus 4. So those cancel, and I'm left with plus 5. Okay. So this is the factored form going through factor by grouping. And I'll remind you, when we use the box method, I'll zoom out here real quick. The only thing that happened is the parentheses are in a different position, but we have a 3x plus 4, 3x plus 4, 2x plus 5, a 2x plus 5. So you get the same answer. It might show up in a different order, but that's of no consequence. It doesn't matter. All right, we'll do the last factor by grouping. As we did in the previous example, with a negative sign here, just to give you a little help how that can be handled. So if we had 6x squared minus 23x plus 20, you go through this same process. You multiply first times last, and that gives you 120, and then you list all the factors. And 120, 260, 340, 430, 524, 6, 20, 7 won't work, 8, 15, 10, and 12. Okay, but now this time we do want a sum. Signs are going to be the same, but we want to end up with a negative 23. So it must be a negative 8x and a negative 15x. I'm just assuming you've gotten tired of watching me go through the list here. So we end up with these two, but again, the idea is for factor by grouping, you take this middle term and you split it into the correct two terms that will sum to a negative 23. So negative 23x can be written as negative 8x and negative 15x. All right. And then the 6x squared, that just drops down. And the plus 20. Okay. And again, for grouping, we first pay attention to the first two terms. With the 6x squared and negative 8x, I can factor out a 2x. Oops, excuse me there. So that's what we'll do. We'll factor out our 2x. Means I'm dividing by 2x, dividing by 2x. That leaves me with 3x minus 4. Okay, and here you have to be quite careful. Notice that I have 3x minus 4 in parentheses, and when I end up with my set of parentheses over here, I want to end up with 3x minus 4. I want what's inside these parentheses to be exactly the same. Right now that's a plus 20. I have a negative 15x. So instead of just factoring out a 5, I'm going to factor out a negative 5. So if I divide this by negative 5, I'll get a positive 3x. Divide this by negative 5, I'll get a negative 4. Now notice my greatest common factor in parentheses here is 3x minus 4. That's what I'm going to factor out. And I'll be left with just a 2x and a minus 5. And again, I'll just show you quickly. When we did our box method, so I'll step out one more. There it is. We have a 2x minus 5, a 2x minus 5, 3x minus 4, and 3x minus 4. So it doesn't matter which of the methods you use. Each one will get you to the same answer.